He couldn't look up, not at ceilings, not at the sky, not at anything that existed above his head, without his whole body shutting down. His vision narrowing to a tunnel, his chest going so tight he couldn't draw a single breath. It started when he was 4 years old. One day he was fine. The next day he wasn't. No incident, no trauma, no moment he could point to and say that's when it started. It just arrived, like something had been placed inside him overnight, something heavy and cold and absolute. Psychiatrists called it agoraphobia. Psychologists called it a panic disorder. One specialist called it a neurological anomaly and suggested his brain was misfiring in a way that might never fully resolve. Daniel tried everything. Medication that made him feel like he was living underwater. Therapy that helped him manage the symptoms but never touched the root. Breathing exercises. Exposure therapy. Virtual reality programs designed to gradually desensitize him to the thing that terrified him. Nothing worked. 26 years of nothing working. And then Dr. Helen put him under and asked him to go back to the first time he felt afraid to look up. And he didn't go back to age 4. He went back to a life where he died looking up. And in that moment, everything changed. The office was on the ground floor, which Dr. Helen had learned years ago was important for certain clients. People with height-related phobias sometimes couldn't even ride an elevator to reach a therapist's office on an upper floor. The act of ascending triggering panic before the session could even begin. She'd built her practice on the understanding that fear is real, even when its source is invisible, that the body doesn't care whether the danger is logical or not, that a soul carrying trauma from another lifetime would respond to triggers in this one with the same intensity as if the trauma had happened yesterday. Daniel sat in her office in a worn armchair with his feet flat on the floor, both hands gripping the armrests, his jaw tight even in the relative safety of a room, with no height, no openness, no exposure to anything above him, except the low ceiling painted a calming shade of blue. He'd been told about regression therapy by a friend who had success with it for a different kind of fear. He'd come as a last resort. He'd tried everything else and was running out of reasons to keep trying. Dr. Helen guided him down gently, counting through layers of consciousness, asking him to release each part of his body, to imagine warmth spreading through his limbs, to let the sound of her voice become the only thing that mattered. Daniel went under slower than she expected, his anxiety working against the relaxation even in the safety of the room, his nervous system so attuned to threat that letting go felt dangerous in itself. But eventually, gradually, like ice thawing in very slow motion, he surrendered to the depth. His breathing slowed, his hands released the armrests, his jaw unclenched, and Dr. Helen, watching the shift happen, felt that familiar charge in the air that told her they were about to go somewhere significant. She asked him to find the feeling, not to think about it or analyze it, just to feel it. The tightness in his chest when he looked up, the shutting down, the absolute terror. She asked him to let that feeling be his guide, to follow it backward through time, like following a thread through darkness, trusting it to lead him to wherever it began. Daniel's face changed almost immediately. The calm of hypnosis cracked and something else moved underneath it, something old and frightened, and his breathing started to quicken in a way that told Dr. Helen they'd already arrived somewhere that mattered. "Where are you, Daniel? What do you see?" His voice came out rough, scraped raw by something. "I'm in a city, an old city, stone buildings, narrow streets. The air smells wrong, thick, dirty. There's something burning somewhere, not a fire for warmth, something chemical, something that stings my eyes. And there's a crowd, a big one. They all moving in the same direction, and I am moving with them because you do, unstop. Moving when a crowd this size is going somewhere in a city like this." Dr. Helen felt the atmosphere in the room shift, felt the quality of the air change in a way she'd learned over years of doing this work meant they were deep, deeper than most sessions went this quickly. She asked what was happening, why the crowd was moving, what Daniel could perceive about the situation, and his answer came in fragments. Pieces of awareness assembling themselves into a picture that was growing darker with every detail. "Something's happening in the square, something everyone wants to see. I don't want to see it. I already know what it is. I can feel it. The fear in the air is so thick it's almost a taste. People around me are excited, but underneath the excitement there's something else, something ugly, something hungry. And I'm trying to turn around, trying to push against the current of both, but there are too many of them, and the street is too narrow, and I can't get out." The mystery was taking shape, the central question of the entire regression assembling itself from the fragments Daniel was providing. Dr. Helen asked what was happening in the square. what the crowd had come to see, and Daniel's body went rigid in the chair. His hands gripped the armrests again, knuckles white, and when he spoke his voice had dropped to almost nothing, barely audible. They're going to burn someone. There's a pyre, already built, already stacked with wood, and they're bringing someone out. A man, chained, dressed in white that's already gray with dirt, and the crowd is cheering like it's a celebration, like this is entertainment, like watching a human being die is something to enjoy on a Tuesday afternoon. Dr. Helen kept her voice steady even though something cold was moving through her own chest. She asked Daniel if he knew the man, if he recognized him, and the answer made the room feel like it had shrunk by half. Yes, I know him. He's my brother, my younger brother. He's 22 years old. He hasn't done anything wrong. He was accused of practicing forbidden knowledge, of reading books that the church said were dangerous, of asking questions that powerful people didn't want asked. And that was enough. That was all it took. In this time, in this place, asking the wrong question could get you burned alive in front of hundreds of people who would watch and cheer and go home afterward and eat dinner and sleep and not lose a single night as sleep over what they witnessed. The first wave of revelation was cresting now, the connection between the past life trauma and the present life phobia starting to become visible even before Daniel had consciously drawn the line himself. Dr. Helen asked what happened next, asked him to stay with the memory even though everything in his body was screaming to leave it, to trust that seeing it fully was the only way through. Daniel's breathing was fast and shallow now, his chest heaving, his face wet with sweat even though the room was cool. They tied him to the post. My brother. They tied him, and the crowd was so loud, and someone lit the flame at the base and it caught immediately. The wood had been soaked in something to make sure it would burn fast and hot, and I couldn't move, I couldn't scream, I couldn't do anything except stand there in that crowd of strangers and watch my brother die. And the last thing he did before the smoke took him, the last thing he did was look up. He looked up at the sky, like he was looking for something, like he was trying to see past what was happening to him, to something beyond it, something larger, something that made this bearable. And I looked up too, following his gaze, trying to see what he was seeing, trying to find whatever he had found that let him face this moment without breaking completely. And when I looked up, when I lifted my eyes from the flames and looked at the sky above that square, something broke in me, something that had nothing to do with what I saw and everything to do with the fact that I'd looked, that I'd lifted my gaze upward in that moment. That the last shared act between me and my brother was both of us looking up at the same time, and everything about that moment, the fire and the crowd and the smoke and the sky and the sound of my brother's body ending, all of it got stamped into me at once, fused together, inseparable, looking up in terror and loss and helplessness and grief, all one thing, all coded into my nervous system in a single devastating instant that I carried forward into every life after it without knowing why. Dr. Helen let the silence hold, let Daniel's body shake through the wave of emotion, watched his face cycle through grief and rage and helplessness and something that looked like the specific kind of pain that comes from being unable to save someone you love. She knew not to rush this part, knew that the body needed time to process what the mind had just understood, that healing at this level wasn't intellectual. It was cellular. It was the nervous system finally understanding why it had been responding the way it had been responding for 26 years, finally getting the information it needed to stop treating every ceiling and every open sky as if it was the sky above that burning square. She asked Daniel to go back to his brother in that moment, to speak to him across the distance of whatever number of lifetimes separated them now. And Daniel opened his mouth, but nothing came out for a long time. When it did come, it was barely a whisper. I'm sorry I couldn't save you. I'm sorry I just stood there. I was so afraid, so young, so completely helpless. I've been carrying this my whole life without knowing I was carrying it, and now I understand why I couldn't look up, why the sky terrifies me. Because the last time I looked up, it was to watch you die. And my body never stopped believing that if I look up again, I'll see it again. I'll feel it again. The fire and the smoke and you and me and the sky and all of it at once. Something shifted in the room. Not metaphorically. Dr. Helen felt it physically, a change in pressure, a change in temperature, a change in the quality of the air that she'd learned over years of work meant something was releasing, something was moving from one state to another. Something that had been locked in place was finally being set free. Daniel's breathing began to slow. His hands released the armrests for the second time. His face, which had been contorted with grief, began to soften, and he said something that Dr. Helen would think about for months afterward. He said my brother looked up because he was free. He was looking at the sky because even though they were taking his body, they couldn't take where his consciousness was going. He was looking at what came next. And I followed him with my eyes because some part of me knew that too. Knew that death wasn't the end. Knew that the sky wasn't just sky. It was a doorway. And I was so terrified of the doorway that I spent my entire next life refusing to look at it. Dr. Helen asked him to move forward a little, to see what happened in that past life after the burning. How he lived with what he'd witnessed. Daniel's face aged in front of her, not physically but in expression, in the way grief settles into features and changes the shape of a person's relationship to the world. I never recovered. In that life, I withdrew completely, stopped going outside, stopped looking up, kept my eyes on the ground for the rest of my life, lived in rooms with low ceilings and no windows, died old and broken and alone in a house that smelled like damp stone in fear. And the fear followed me here, followed me into this life where there's no pyre and no church court and no crowd cheering for someone's death. The fear doesn't know that. The fear just knows that the last time I looked up, something terrible happened, and it's been protecting me from looking up ever since. She asked if he could see the connection now, if he could feel the thread that ran from that moment in the square to the panic attacks he'd been having since age 4. And Daniel laughed, a wet, broken sound that was equal parts grief and relief. Of course I can. It's so obvious now. It's been so obvious all along. I just couldn't see it because I was inside it. I was the fear. The fear was me, and now I can see it from the outside for the first time. I can see the scared young man in that square, and I can see the scared little boy in this life, and I can see that they breathe the same fear wearing different clothes. Same wound, same belief. Same absolute conviction that looking up is dangerous, just wearing a different life around it like a shell. Dr. Helen guided him through the next part with care, the part that in her experience made or broke whether a regression actually produced lasting change. Understanding the source of a fear was important, but understanding alone didn't always heal. What healed was the moment of release, the moment when the emotional charge that had been attached to the memory finally discharged, the moment when the nervous system received permission to let go of something it had been holding for far too long. She asked Daniel to go back to his brother one more time, to find him not in the square, not in the moment of the burning, but after, in whatever came after death for him, in whatever space his consciousness entered when his body was gone. Daniel went quiet for several minutes. His face did something complex. Something that moved through several emotions too quickly to name individually. And when he spoke again, his voice was different, lighter somehow, like some weight had been lifted from it. He's okay. He's more than okay. He's laughing. He's showing me that he wasn't afraid. Not really. He was terrified in the body, in the flesh, the way anyone would be. But underneath that, underneath the human terror, he knew exactly where he was going, and he wasn't scared of it at all. He went there with his eyes open, with his face toward the sky. Not because he was looking for salvation or escape, because he was looking at the next thing, the next beautiful thing. And he wants me to know that looking up isn't dangerous. It never was. Looking up is how you see what comes next. And I've been refusing to see what comes next for 26 years, because I confused the act of looking with the act of losing him. They're not the same thing. They were never the same thing. Dr. Helen watched Daniel's breathing settle into something deep and slow, watched the last of the tension leave his body, watched something fundamental reorganize itself behind his closed eyes. She'd seen this happen before, many times. The moment when a past life memory loses its charge and becomes just a memory instead of an active wound. The difference was always visible, always palpable. The client didn't just understand something new. They felt different. Their body felt different. The fear that had been running their responses for years or decades or lifetimes just stopped running them. Not suppressed, not managed, released, like a knot that had been pulled tight for so long everyone forgot it had ever been anything but a knot finally being untied. When Daniel opened his eyes, he blinked several times, adjusting to the room, to the present, to the ordinary reality of a ground floor office with its low blue ceiling and its quiet white noise machine. And then he did something that made Dr. Helen's breath catch. He looked up, slowly, deliberately, up at the ceiling, up at the fluorescent lights, up at the space above his head that he had been unable to look at without panic for the entirety of his conscious memory. And nothing happened. No tightness, no tunnel vision, no shutting down. Just him, looking up, breathing normally, existing in a body that was finally free of something it had been carrying for longer than one lifetime. He looked back down at Dr. Helen, and his face was wet, but he was smiling. A real smile. Not the kind of smile someone puts on to make other people comfortable. The kind that comes from inside, when something that's been broken for a very long time suddenly isn't anymore. He said, "I can look up now. I actually can. It doesn't feel like anything. It just feels like looking. Like that's all it ever was. Just looking." Dr. Helen kept careful notes on Daniel's progress in the months that followed, not because she doubted what had happened in the session, but because she wanted to document the pattern, wanted to understand how quickly and how completely past life trauma could resolve when the source was found and the emotional charge was released. Within 3 days of the session, Daniel reported that the panic attacks had stopped entirely, not reduced, not lessened, stopped. He could ride an elevator for the first time since he was 4 years old, could walk through a crowd without the constant vigilance of someone bracing for an attack that never came, could look up at the sky, at buildings, at trees, at anything above him, and feel nothing except the simple, quiet pleasure of someone noticing the world. 6 weeks after the session, he went outside on a clear night and looked up at the stars for the first time in his life. Really looked. Not a glance followed by a flinch. A long, unhurried, peaceful look at the vast, dark space above him, filled with light, and he told Dr. Helen afterward that standing there looking up at the stars felt like coming home, like something in him that had been clenched tight for 26 years, maybe longer, maybe across multiple lifetimes of clenching, finally let go, finally understood that up wasn't the enemy, that the sky wasn't a threat, that looking up was just looking up, that his brother had known that all along, had been trying to show him that all along, had been looking up in that final moment, not in despair, but in recognition, in welcome, in the kind of peace that only comes from knowing exactly where you're going and not being afraid to go there. Daniel started volunteering at a crisis line after that, not because anyone suggested it or because he felt he owed the universe something in return for what happened in that session. He just felt called to it, felt like the thing that had been holding him back from being fully present, fully available, fully alive in his own life, was gone, and the space it left needed to be filled with something purposeful. He wanted to help people who were stuck the way he'd been stuck. People carrying fears they couldn't explain. People whose bodies were responding to threats that didn't exist in the present, because the present was the wrong timeline to be looking in. He could tell them about regression therapy, without them thinking he was suggesting something too strange or too alternative or too outside the mainstream. But he could listen, could sit with them in their fear without flinching, could be proof, just by existing, just by being present, that whatever you're afraid of isn't necessarily permanent. That some fears have expiration dates. That the thing keeping you locked in a room with the curtains drawn might have a key that's been hidden in a life you don't remember living yet. Dr. Helen has worked with dozens of clients over the years who suffered from phobias that had no traceable origin in their current lifetime. Fear of fire that began at birth, in people who had never been anywhere near a fire. Fear of dogs, in people who had never been bitten or frightened by one. Fear of being watched. Fear of enclosed spaces. Fear of water. Fear of the dark. Fear of birds. Fear of hands reaching for them. Seemingly random, seemingly irrational, seemingly impossible to cure through any conventional method. And in regression after regression, the source was always the same kind of thing. A moment in another lifetime when something terrible happened, and the body encoded the trigger and the response together, so tightly that no amount of rational thinking in this lifetime could separate them. Because the body doesn't care what lifetime something happened in, doesn't care how many deaths and rebirths have occurred between then and now. The nervous system holds on to trauma the way a photograph holds on to an image, faithfully, permanently, until someone shows it the rest of the picture, until someone gives it context, until the frozen moment in time gets unfrozen and allowed to complete itself, and the energy that was trapped in it gets released, and the body finally understands that the danger is over and has been over for a very long time. He goes hiking, looks up at cliffs and mountains and open sky, and breathes the way people who have never been afraid to breathe just breathe. Sometimes he thinks about his brother from that other life, the young man who looked up at the sky while he was burning and found something there worth looking at. He doesn't know where that brother is now, doesn't know if he's incarnated again somewhere, living some other life, carrying some other lesson, but he likes to think that somewhere, in some form, that soul is still looking up, still seeing what comes next. still showing anyone who's willing to follow his gaze that the sky is something to be afraid of. If you've been carrying a fear you can't explain, a terror that has no rational source, a response in your body to something that should be ordinary but feels like the end of the world, maybe it's not from this life. Maybe somewhere, in a life you've forgotten, something happened that got coded into your nervous system so deeply that it followed you here. That doesn't mean you're stuck with it forever. That doesn't mean you have to keep living around it, building your entire existence in the shape of its demands. Because the moment it happened is over, has been over for longer than you can imagine. And the fear is just the body's way of trying to protect you from something that isn't there anymore. And when you finally see what it was protecting you from, when you give it the full picture instead of just the frozen frame, the protection becomes unnecessary, the fear loses its power, and you can finally look up. There are others who have done this, who have found the source and released the charge and walked out of a regression session free of something that had controlled them for years. The fear wasn't from this life, but the healing is, and it starts here. The next one starts now.